You sit down to do something that matters to you. Maybe it's studying for an exam. Maybe it's working on a business you've been talking about for months. Maybe it's going to the gym, writing a book, applying for jobs, learning a language, or finally fixing something in your life you've been avoiding. You know exactly what you should do. You even want to do it. And then something strange happens. You open your laptop, you look at the work, and suddenly, checking your phone feels important. You tell yourself you'll start in 5 minutes. 5 minutes becomes 20. 20 becomes an hour. And eventually, you close everything and tell yourself the same thing you've told yourself before. I'm just lazy. But what if that's not what's happening? What if the real problem isn't that you don't care enough? What if, every time you escape something uncomfortable, you're teaching your brain a very simple lesson? Not consciously, not intentionally, but through repetition, a lesson that says, when something feels difficult, uncomfortable, boring, uncertain, or overwhelming, leave. And the dangerous part is that leaving works, at least for a few seconds. The moment you stop doing the difficult thing, the discomfort drops, you feel relief. And that relief is exactly what can make the behavior repeat. Researchers Fascia Sirois and Timothy Peichel have argued that procrastination can function as short-term mood regulation. In other words, when a task makes you feel bad in the present, avoiding it can temporarily make you feel better, even though it creates problems for your future self. So you aren't necessarily choosing pleasure over your goals. Sometimes you're choosing relief over discomfort, and those two things look almost identical from the outside. You say you're procrastinating. Your brain may be trying to regulate how you feel right now. That distinction changes everything, because if the problem were simply laziness, the solution would be obvious. Try harder, become more disciplined, wake up earlier, push yourself. But if the problem is a learned cycle of discomfort, avoidance, and relief, then trying to overwhelm yourself with motivation may actually miss the point. And this is where the story gets interesting, because the behavior you think is proof that you're weak may actually be the result of a very predictable psychological loop. It usually begins much earlier than the moment you give up. It begins when you see the task. Imagine you have an important project due in 2 weeks. Nothing is physically stopping you from starting. But the task carries uncertainty. You don't know exactly how to begin. You worry it won't be good enough. You know it will take hours. You might make mistakes. You might discover you're not as good at it as you hoped. Your brain doesn't need to calculate all of that consciously. It just needs to register one thing. This feels bad, and now you have two options. Move toward the discomfort or move away from it. If you move toward it, the discomfort remains for a while. If you move away, the discomfort often drops almost immediately. You check a message, you watch a video, you clean your room. You suddenly decide that researching the perfect productivity system is extremely important. And for a moment, you feel better. That's the trap. The behavior doesn't need to make your life better. It only needs to make the next 30 seconds feel better. Researchers studying procrastination have repeatedly found connections between procrastination, coping, stress, and present-focused decision-making. A 2015 meta-analysis by Sirois and Ryan Kittner found that procrastination was positively associated with maladaptive coping, and that coping processes helped explain part of its relationship with stress. So the first thing your brain learns isn't, "I should never work hard." It's something much simpler. That feeling was unpleasant. Avoiding it made the feeling go away. And once that happens repeatedly, you don't need to consciously decide to avoid the task anymore. The pattern becomes easier to repeat. But here's the part nobody talks about. The most dangerous consequence of procrastination isn't the hour you lose. It's the lesson you might be teaching yourself during that hour. Because every repeated behavior has consequences beyond the behavior itself. If you repeatedly approach difficult things and stay with them, you collect evidence that discomfort is survivable. If you repeatedly escape difficult things, you collect evidence that discomfort must be escaped. And that changes the question. Instead of asking, "Why can't I make myself do this?" ask, "What does my behavior teach me to expect the next time I feel this way?" That is a much more useful question, because you may not have a motivation problem. You may have an avoidance pattern, and avoidance has a strange property. It gets stronger when it works. Think about fear. If you're afraid of public speaking and you avoid every opportunity to speak, you get immediate relief. But the relief doesn't prove that speaking was dangerous. It proves that avoiding it worked. The same basic logic can appear in everyday productivity. The assignment feels overwhelming. You avoid it. You feel better. The meeting makes you nervous. You cancel. You feel better. The workout feels difficult. You skip it. You feel better. The conversation you've been avoiding makes you uncomfortable. You postpone it. You feel better. The brain receives the same basic message. Escape produces relief. And that's why simply telling yourself to be more disciplined can be frustrating. You're fighting a loop that has been rewarding the escape. So what actually breaks the loop? The answer isn't to wait until the task feels easy. It probably won't. The answer is to change what happens immediately after discomfort appears. And that brings us to the second part of the problem. You have probably been taught to think of motivation as the thing that comes before action. You feel motivated, then you act. But real life often works in the opposite direction. You act first. Then motivation catches up. Think about the last time you exercised when you didn't feel like it. You probably didn't become intensely motivated while sitting on the couch. You stood up. You put on your shoes. You started moving. And somewhere after the beginning, the resistance became smaller. The same thing happens with work. The first 5 minutes can feel terrible. Then you understand the problem. Then you make progress. Then the task becomes less threatening. The beginning was the hardest part. This is why the size of the first action matters so much. If your brain hears, "Finish the entire project tonight," that's an enormous psychological demand. But if it hears, "Open the document and write one sentence," the threat is smaller. You're not promising to finish. You're not promising to become a completely different person. You're simply refusing to escape during the first moment of discomfort. That sounds almost too simple, but simple is exactly what makes it useful. Because you're trying to change the association. Discomfort no longer has to mean escape. Discomfort can mean begin. Stay for 5 minutes. Take the first step. Then decide what comes next. And there is another reason this matters. Your future self is always competing with your present self. The future version of you wants the finished project. The present version of you wants the uncomfortable feeling to disappear. And the present version usually has the advantage because the reward is immediate. Fushia Siroya's 2014 meta-analysis found that procrastination was moderately associated with a weaker future time perspective and slightly stronger present time perspective. The research also linked stress and lower positive affect to part of that relationship. In simple terms, the future reward can be real and important, but the present feeling is immediate. That's why, "This will help me in 6 months," can lose to, "I don't want to feel like this right now." Your brain is not necessarily confused. It's responding to different time horizons. So you need to make the future matter to the present. One way to do that is to stop negotiating with yourself about the entire task. Don't ask, "Do I feel like doing this?" Ask, "What is the smallest action that moves this forward?" That question changes the psychological battle, because now you aren't trying to manufacture motivation. You're trying to create movement, and movement creates something extremely important: evidence. Every time you do something you expected yourself to avoid, you collect evidence about yourself. Not evidence that you're perfect. Not evidence that you'll never procrastinate again. Evidence that you can act while uncomfortable. That is a completely different identity. And this is where the title becomes more precise. You're not literally training your brain to give up every time you procrastinate. That's too simplistic, but repeated patterns can shape what becomes easier, more automatic, and more expected. And that means the opposite is also possible. You can practice staying. You can practice beginning before you feel ready. You can practice tolerating the first wave of discomfort. You can practice finishing small things instead of constantly restarting. And over time, the important thing you're building isn't motivation, it's trust. Trust that when you tell yourself you're going to do something, you don't immediately disappear when it becomes uncomfortable. But there is a third problem. Sometimes people hear this and make the exact opposite mistake. They decide the solution is to become brutally disciplined. No breaks, no rest, no flexibility. Work harder, push through everything. Never give yourself an excuse. That can create another cycle. Because if every goal becomes a test of your worth, then starting becomes emotionally expensive. And when starting feels dangerous to your identity, avoidance becomes attractive again. This is one reason perfectionism can become tangled with procrastination. Research by Saruas and colleagues has examined the relationship between perfectionism, self-criticism, and goal pursuit, rather than treating procrastination as a simple failure of effort. Think about what happens when you tell yourself, I need to write something amazing. Now the task isn't simply writing, it's proving that you're talented. I need to have the perfect workout. Now the workout isn't simply exercise. It's proving that you're disciplined. I need to build the perfect business. Now beginning isn't simply beginning. It's exposing yourself to the possibility that your idea might fail. The pressure grows, and when the pressure grows, avoidance becomes more attractive. So the goal isn't to make every task emotionally comfortable. The goal is to make discomfort less meaningful. You don't have to interpret difficulty as evidence that you're failing. Sometimes difficulty is just the beginning of the process. That is the emotional turn, because maybe the moment you feel like quitting isn't evidence that you should quit. Maybe it's simply the moment your old pattern expects you to leave. And if you stay for another minute, you have interrupted the pattern. Not conquered it, interrupted it. That's enough. Because change usually doesn't happen through one dramatic decision. It happens through repeated contradictions. You tell yourself, I don't work when I'm tired. Then you do 10 minutes. I always quit when something gets difficult. Then you stay 5 minutes longer. I never finish anything. Then you finish something small. I need motivation before I begin. Then you begin without it. Each action is small, but each one gives your brain new evidence. And that is why you should stop measuring progress only by outcomes. Measure some of it by responses. How quickly do you escape discomfort? How quickly do you reach for your phone? How often do you restart instead of continuing? How often do you wait for the perfect mood? And most importantly, what do you do in the first 30 seconds after you don't feel like doing something? That moment matters, because motivation is often discussed as if it's a feeling that arrives and gives you permission to act. But action can also create the conditions in which motivation becomes easier. You don't need to feel ready to begin. You need a beginning small enough that you don't have to negotiate with yourself for 20 minutes. Open the document, write the first sentence, put on the shoes, read the first page, make the first call, study for 10 minutes, work until the timer ends. Then stop if you genuinely need to stop. The objective isn't to prove that you can suffer forever. It's to prove that discomfort doesn't control the next decision. And once you understand that, the entire idea of laziness starts to look different. Because imagine going back to that moment from the beginning. You're sitting there, the task is still difficult. You still don't feel particularly motivated. The phone is still nearby. The easy escape is still available. Nothing magical has happened. But this time, you notice the feeling. You don't immediately obey it. You say, this is uncomfortable, not, I'm lazy, not, I'm incapable, not, I'll never change. Just, this is uncomfortable. Then you begin. One small action, and maybe nothing dramatic happens. Maybe you don't suddenly become productive for 6 hours. Maybe you only work for 10 minutes. But 10 minutes is enough to prove something. You can feel resistance without running from it. And that is the skill you've been missing. Not endless motivation, not perfect discipline, not some secret morning routine. The ability to remain in the room when your brain gives you a reason to leave. Because every time you escape, you make escape a little easier. And every time you stay, you give yourself another piece of evidence that staying is possible. It needs repeated experiences that contradict the old pattern. You don't have to win every day. You just have to stop teaching yourself that discomfort automatically means surrender. So the next time you hear that familiar voice saying, I'll do it later, pause before you believe it. Ask yourself one question. Am I actually tired, or am I trying to escape a feeling? If you're genuinely exhausted, rest. If you're overwhelmed, reduce the task. If you don't know what to do, make the next step smaller. But if you're simply uncomfortable, stay. Start badly. Start slowly. Start without motivation. Because the person who changes their life isn't always the person who feels the strongest desire to change. Sometimes it's the person who learns not to obey every feeling that tells them to stop. And maybe that's the real difference between the version of you that keeps starting over and the version that finally moves forward. Not that one is lazy and the other is disciplined. Not that one has motivation and the other doesn't. The difference is what happens when the first wave of discomfort arrives. One version escapes. The other begins. And after enough repetitions, those two choices can lead to completely different lives. So don't ask yourself tomorrow whether you feel motivated. Ask something smaller, something more honest. What is the next action? Then do that. And when your brain tells you to stop because this is uncomfortable, remember, you don't have to defeat the feeling. You just have to stop letting the feeling make the decision. Your brain doesn't need you to become a completely different person tomorrow. Just one small step, today,